works. Super. So I appreciate this is the last talk before lunch. Lunch is probably more important, so I'll try to be quick. So hopefully you're in the right place. As mentioned, the title of the talk, bit of a clickbait title, Overcoming the DevSecOps Imposter Syndrome, but speaking to the organizers and some of the attendees who came here last year, it seemed to be quite a hot topic, at least last year. So if my clicker works, there we go. So a bit about myself. So I've been in the industry for over 20 years, so one of the older senior generations. 6 years ago, I founded a community meetup called DevSecOps London Gathering. So if you believe meetup.com, it's the largest independent DevSecOps community in the world. I also help conferences. For example, I'm part of the CFP review panel for a conference called DevSecCon. And in terms of technical certifications, I embarked on a hands-on pen testing course called Offensive Security Certified Professional, where the exam's actually a 24-hour assault course where you have to compromise networks and systems and obviously win points to pass the exam. Bit of a challenge. So, imposter syndrome. This is something I think everybody in IT generally kind of suffers from. This talk is going to focus specifically on DevSecOps, and I'll share some of my thinking, my approach as to how I actually tackle this problem. Not saying I've solved it, but a few years ago I kind of went through a moment in my life where it was a bit negative. And so I went through a reset program to try and bring myself back up. So you guys are probably quite familiar with the timeline for DevOps, but have you actually thought about the timeline for security in parallel to DevOps? So I've kind of tried to illustrate this in this picture, broken it up into 3 different sections. So kind of turn of the century, sounds really long time ago now, right? So security was kind of, let's protect the perimeter, right? Let's stop bad things coming in and data leakage or data going out, because that's ultimately what we're trying to protect as an organization. Let it be customer data or IPR that you own as a business. And so product security became a thing, and I was part of a number of different product security teams where I engaged with projects to inject security requirements, try to follow through in terms of the implementation and the assurance of the developed, created solution. Now, kind of fast forward a bit into the middle section, which I've kind of titled Agile, where the whole Agile movement became very stimulated, right? So other talks earlier today and yesterday kind of mentioned how this community started and people started to try to understand what is DevOps, etc., and Agile manifestos and other good artifacts were kind of created within the industry. In parallel to that, security also involved. It became recognized that it was important for business to kind of pay attention to it. And so the creation of company security policies was done. The role of a CISO, so the Chief Information Security Officer, became a thing. And so you started to have a centralized security team where you had different experts or SMEs focusing on different security domains, such as network security or incident management or software security, which kind of relates more to DevSecOps. And kind of fast forward that into maybe just shy of 10 years ago, everything has become code, and the term DevSecOps became a thing. So about 6, 7 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, there was a conference called DevSecCon, originally held in London and then became a global thing. And around about the same time, I started my meetup. And the reason why I did was because I felt the conference was really great. And so I thought, well, if I feel like this, right, there must be a group of people within my region, within my city, London, who would like to kind of learn from each other and understand what this topic actually means. So that was kind of my driver to starting the meetup. Oh, I see an error in my slide. 1 minute. There we go. Was that agile? Maybe I did it on purpose. Yes, I'll try and remember that for next time. So so I've talked about the timelines of development, of security, how that's kind of changed over the last 2 decades. Wow, that sounds so long. From a delivery point of view, I think most of us have various different roles, and we probably only see part of the process, right? If you kind of zoom in. But if you kind of step out a bit, right? In most organizations, it kind of breaks down into these 5 different stages. So someone has a crazy idea, which they call a business change or business driver, right? And it's going to make us loads of money. And then it's like, how do we actually deliver this? This talk is not going to cover the challenges between a project team and a products team, but you pick and choose one of those, right? I think most of us would probably appreciate a product team approach rather than project-based. We can chat about that offline after this talk. But once you've kind of identified the structure, the resources you need, then it's like, right, this crazy idea that someone or a team has come up with, how do we actually make this happen? And so you translate that requirement into some sort of high-level design and architecture. And at this stage, you're potentially losing some of the original intent of the business change. Quickly moving on, right, so we've got this high-level design, this architecture. How do we then actually crank the code, buy commercial off-the-shelf software to kind of build this solution? So the design aspect of it. And then hopefully you do some testing, as mentioned by the lady in the previous talk, very important, including security testing. And then you go live, you go to market. And then hopefully the elapsed time between the original crazy idea and when you go to market is kind of sufficient to prove that your hypothesis is actually going to make money for your organization. So I actually work with organizations to, people are familiar with value stream mapping? One, okay, a few, okay. So it's a technique to essentially understand your process and understand where there are bottlenecks, and you try to optimize those. So this, you can say, is a very, very high level one of those things, but you tend to deep dive into certain aspects. So my work is around software security, so I work with teams and organizations to kind of focus on that. There was a talk yesterday by Jan, hopefully I've remembered the speaker's name correctly and pronounced it correctly, where he talked about threat modeling, right? So that's an important exercise, but terms like threat modeling, risk assessment, right? Mentally for me, that's kind of like, ooh, that sounds quite serious, quite hard. Maybe I'm not qualified to actually be involved or talk about it or even conduct it. So rightly or wrongly, in my own head, I've come up with another term, because everybody likes creating new terms, right? And because I don't like typing a lot, I've actually abbreviated. So DSO, DevSecOps, DSO modeling. So in my mind is when you factor in security in terms of your delivery, your design, there's kind of a number of different aspects that I have to build in my mental model. So there's the language, right? What are the terms that we need to understand and agree with? So an example of this would be within the payment card industry data security standard, or PCI DSS, as mentioned earlier, right? The technical term for your credit card is actually PAN, P-A-N, primary account number, right? But for the uninitiated, people not within that circle of knowledge, it's like, what's a PAN? Why didn't you call it a credit card? So that's probably a classic example of terminology. And then if you kind of drip that down further in terms of your delivery and design, right? So what's the variable name for the credit card in your code? So having that traceability, having that understanding so that everybody in your team knows what you're talking about and referring to. That's very important. The other areas for me are the user journey. So e-commerce website, it's probably a classic one. You kind of look at the product catalog. Oh, I want one of those books or 10 of those, right? So that's the happy path. But from a security point of view, what's the naughty thing I can actually do? So if the quantity field isn't a drop-down, it's a free field, and I can put in numbers, what happens if I put -10? Does that mean I get a refund? Because the business logic or the business code would accept that value, right? So from a DSO modeling point of view, that's an example of the type of things that you need to kind of consider as part of the user journey. Similarly, for the service journey, what I mean by that is how does different components, elements, systems actually interact with each other, right? So in the previous talk, we talked about payment cards, actually. That tends not to work. That's because the payment gateway is managed by a third party, and what's that link, what's that handshake? That's quite important, right? You need to understand, again, what's the happy path, but then similarly, what could go wrong intentionally or unintentionally. And then the operational journey is, well, you need to maintain it, right? Changes happen. What is that process? Are you doing GitOps? You're super elite, so everything's code. Once it's committed, the right test goes through, and then bang, you've got a live system. Not everybody's like that. It's like when you hear talks in other conferences, or maybe in this conference, where I own the full stack and stuff like that. But most of the organizations I've worked in, you don't own the full stack. Okay, principles. It was mentioned again in earlier talks, the DevOps principles. I won't rattle through these, but the two books, the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Projects, great books, if you like. If you haven't read these books, they're kind of written in a novel-style approach. Both books are actually talking about the same story, but from the perspective of a different character within the book. And I think about 10 years has elapsed between the first and the second, but still both very relevant. And essentially, it boils down to the 3 ways and 5 ideals. So that's kind of Gene Kim's and co trying to articulate the core principles around DevOps. For security, we kind of try to do it, right? So CIA, not the agency in North America, that's kind of the traditional pillar within security. So CIA stands for, I don't expect you to read this, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And then it's like, what does that all mean in terms of my solution? And then over time, other people have come up with other acronyms. DIME made me giggle, right? That stands for distributed, immutable, ephemeral, and so on and so on. Actually, the last column, I made up that name, DSO principle, is actually from the US DoD, their Defense Department. So they're very, as somebody swore already, so I'll swear again, very shit hot at DevSecOps. So they've got an architecture white paper and good things like that. So it's definitely worth hunting those down. And obviously you can read the links, but those are the links. And we have more stuff, different standards and benchmarks from vendor-independent organizations that focuses and tries to articulate the good things and the bad things when you implement certain technologies. Or even independent consultants working together to share their experience as to what does it mean to factor in security into your pipeline. So and what I'm actually referring to is the secure delivery playbook. Okay, but so what? So I know about the timeline. I believe I know, because Michael said that changes kind of happens like this in an organization. And we have tons of standards. Does that mean I'm in a better place? What does it actually mean for me as an individual from a career point of view? So as part of my journey, I kind of broke it down into these 5 different areas. There's probably more, but these were the ones that came to my mind and I kind of focused and worked through. So cloud, everything's cloud now. So, but then does that mean I should specialize with one or try to learn all of it? Who are the major cloud players in my region, right? So I think in Europe, we typically talk about the 3 players, right? So AWS, Azure, GCP, etc. But if you go elsewhere, maybe they aren't the core players. Engineering, what do I mean by that? So your infrastructure, your platform, the underlying foundation that your application actually needs to sit in, right? That's a knowledge area that's quite important to understand. Architecture, I think that term is fading, or at least my understanding of it is becoming less irrelevant, so that's probably quite controversial. AppSec, broadly 2 types of roles. So there's the people integrating software security tools into the pipelines, and then the other extreme is kind of working with the software engineers, understanding the scan outputs, and helping the team collectively to remediate those findings, and hopefully those mistakes aren't going to be made again. But that's about continuous learning, and probably another talk I have. And then leadership. That sounds quite grand, but what I mean by that is actually soft skills. So we need to work with people, right? You can't do everything by yourself. You need to bond. You need to appreciate, understand, empathize where people are coming from, because everybody's drive is different, right? So the classic is, well, security always gets in the way, right? Their motives, their drivers is very different from probably most of the other business domains or business units within the organizations, where they want to make change because they're changing things to hopefully make money, right? And then pay us. And therefore the perception about security is like, oh, all these checks and balances, always a bit late. I get a stack of results and you want me to fix it now, right? So we do talk about shift left and whatnot, right? But something that I really get upset about is when we talk about secure code training and shift left, and you have vendors, including my company. we have training, secure code training platform. Yes, it's left in the industry, but to me, we talk about if we believe if there's a skill shortage in the industry or not, right? That's not left enough for me, right? The next generation, the people going through academic or trying to teach themselves the skill sets, they need to understand security, right? It shouldn't be a bolt-on, it should be as part of, right? So as the lady mentioned about testing, she mentioned security. It should be another attribute. Let's not overcomplicate things. Okay, everybody likes to play, so tools and testing. Not going to read this definition. I had to change the colors because it looks great on my Mac, but not so great on the screen, so the colors are not what I particularly like. But this is a definition from the CNCF as to what cloud native means, and it kind of talks about attributes of a solution and some of the technologies such as containers, service mesh, etc. That's quite involved as a definition. This slide was, or this picture was used at least a couple of times during the last 2 days. Lots of stuff out there. Which horse do I need to back? If I back the wrong horse, doesn't mean I've wasted time, right? It's a bit of a gamble. And for those that haven't really looked into this diagram, when you kind of zoom in, the CNCF has actually grouped tools into different categories. So there is one for security and compliance. But again, I don't think that's comprehensive enough. They did some great work a few years ago. They've stopped doing this. Their technology radar, where they've kind of assessed their members within the CNCF as to what they were kind of using in terms of, it's kind of on my radar, trialing things out, or I'm actually adopting it. Like I said, I don't believe this is complete from a security point of view. And so I kind of move on and write, well, what is security? I've talked about DSO modeling or threat modeling. This section of the talk is about the tools. So there are different types of testing approaches. So there's, you write code, the code you write, you can make errors, right? So static analysis is probably well known, hopefully. That's the approach you use to check the code you write. But you're not going to reinvent the wheel, right? You're going to use other people's code, import third-party libraries and dependencies, right? Because you don't want to burn cycles to do something that's generic and other people has done well. So you need to appreciate that there could be security issues there, not just from a software vulnerability point of view, code vulnerability point of view, but also from a license point of view, right? Because if you're importing a library and the license says you can use it, but if you use it in a commercial solution that you're going to sell, then no, or I need some royalty. So if you don't understand that, then you can cause challenges for your business. So doing software composition analysis, or SCA, is quite important. So the first two types, static and SCA, that's kind of, in my mind, that's kind of looking at your application from the inside out, because it's code, right? But you also want to look at it or assess it from a security point of view from the outside in. So there's manual pen testing or dynamic analysis that you could do. I have strong opinions about dynamic analysis, as in I don't like it, but that's another conversation. And then everything is code. We talked about infrastructure as code, using CloudFormation, Terraform, containers, Kubernetes, right? To me, that's kind of infrastructure generically. So we need to understand the security postures of those. And again, there was a talk earlier within the conference that touched on that and comparing the CNCF graduate programs and others. I found that talk quite interesting. Or you can refer to external analysts such as Gartner or Forrester, right? And again, I have very strong opinions about these people as well. But not everybody understands the market, right? So, if I'm a senior manager and I'm kind of less hands-on and I've got numerous different domains and areas I need to pay attention to, I'm not going to have the finger on the pulse to understand what specifically is happening in software security. So, rightly or wrongly, there are places for organizations such as Gartner. Doing the right test, so lots of different principles, standards, lots of different ways of testing. There isn't a silver bullet. It's complicated. Again, as part of my reset program, my education, I kind of modeled it in terms of inline testing, i.e. things that you do factor into your pipeline and try to automate, where you cover certain tests to give you quick feedback so that you can react. But then there's also what I call out-of-band testing, where the test execution is somewhat lengthier. So when I kind of poo-pooed DAST, or dynamic analysis, earlier, I don't agree with factoring dynamic analysis into your pipeline, i.e. inline. I believe it's an out-of-band testing, so there's still room for it. Looking at the time, I need to whiz on. So what did I do? So back in 2021, I kind of sat myself down and said, look, I'm kind of working in this space. I think I know about this and that, but it wasn't structured. And so I embarked on creating a training course for myself, and with maybe an idea of commercializing it. It didn't happen. But these are the 8 different areas that I kind of thought of in terms of structuring my knowledge, what I had, or doing research to fill those gaps. So layer 8, people, as I mentioned earlier, POV, point of view. So, what's driving them? How do I actually work with them? How do I make sure they understand where I'm coming from as well? How do you do risk assessment or threat modeling or DSO modeling? Visualization, you can't change or improve if you don't know what's going on. So what are the data points? What would drive corrective behavior for me, for my colleagues, for senior management? What's important for them? Infrastructure as code, why choose Terraform over CloudFormation, all that wonderful good stuff. How do I test it? The architecture, moving from mono to microservices or vice versa, right? Microservices isn't the ultimate solution. How do I automate this? So what I mean by this specifically is, I've got this tool, and this is the template script that I factor into my pipeline in terms of YAML or whatever. That's fine, but how does that scale from an enterprise point of view, where you've got hundreds of teams or maybe thousands of teams and lots of different applications, right? That's the challenge I was trying to think about and I try to overcome. And then the different aspects of application security. Or is that the right term? Or is it software security? And what does that actually mean? Which I kind of touched on earlier. Books. So Paul shared a QR code with lots of books. I have my personal blog site, which capture books, conferences, meetups, podcasts, etc. I tend to read multiple books at the same time because I get bored quite easily. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, not so much on Twitter. There are video news feeds that I follow, so one on YouTube or Twitch. It's broadcast on both platforms, so C9K if you want to kind of look at that. But more importantly, having all this information, what I tend to practice is, if it's a new topic or something I agree, I play it back with some of my contacts or my friends and say, look, I've read this is what I think. Do you agree? Challenge me, right? So, because if I can describe it to someone, that means I've kind of picked up the core messages. So this is kind of my way of learning. Talked about books. A number of these books have been mentioned. That's the link to it. If you kind of remember dsotraining.github.io, you'll find it. Meetups. So as mentioned, I was the founder of a meetup. Like many other people, we went virtual during 2020, straight 2021. I didn't follow the bandwagon of Zooms or Google Hangout because one of the core aspects for what was my meetup was the networking. So we had at least half an hour to network before the talk. The talk happened, and we had like an hour and a half, plus the pub afterwards in terms of networking. For me, that was kind of quite key, and I wanted a platform to simulate that in the virtual world. So I found one. It was free at the time, and after testing it or trying it for like 18 months, they've gone commercial, rightly so. Very clever people behind that. And ultimately, just try things. You read things, you play that back, you come across a new toy, new gadget, just try things. There's nothing wrong. Everybody's at different stages, right? So it could be as basic as customizing your terminal, right? Or even just creating a GitHub account and then cloning or forking a repo and kind of understand that process. It could be as simple as that, or it could be a lot more advanced. I can't draw, and so I follow, everyone's big with AI and ML, right? So I use Midjourney to actually create this of London. So now I think I'm an artist. Thank you very much. That's a QR code to my LinkedIn account.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. And now, again, we have a time for your questions. So if you have a question, just please raise your hand.
Hi, I think I could relate to most of your points, but I'm curious to see when you talk about security, how much do you think can be achieved automatically or in the automation? Is like everything can be automated, or you still see there's need of human intervention with the cognitive skills?
Yes, humans are important, as well as AI. So the classic one is threat modeling. So where you need to, or what I call DSO modeling, right? So What's the happy path? What's the naughty path of your solution? I don't believe you can automate that, right? Now, I've seen solutions try to, but essentially you need to then build up what they call, or what I call, a threat library. So that you're already doing the work beforehand, right? And so there's maintenance of that, right? And technology changes, versions of existing technologies changes with new features, etc. So that's a real ball ache, right, to try and maintain. I think having, maybe the initial gatherings of doing DSO modeling, I'll use my term, right? It can be lengthy, so maybe a couple hours, maybe even a day, right? I suggest not a day. You try and boil it down to, right, what is the problem we're going to talk about, as opposed to, right, this is the solution, let's crack on and go. That you can't automate. Yeah. The more well-established testing approach, such as static analysis or software composition analysis, yes, you can. You can automate those. And many solutions, both open source and commercial solutions are out there where you can automate those.
Is it okay if I can ask another question? Okay, the follow-up question is, so this is also something which test engineering team does. Like, it's a part of my team's job to do security testing. And how is it different from what test engineers do vis-a-vis what you just explained, the overall, in this big picture? Yeah.
So again, you kind of alluded to this topic, and I kind of like reacted by myself in the background in terms of when we talk about doing testing, right? There are different types of testing. So as a software engineer, not saying I am, right? As a software engineer, I'm cracking code in my IDE, right? But I want to do some validation of, is it good or bad? Both functional and non-functional, which includes security testing. So I want the capability of doing that. But also what's important is when I do test it, what's the measuring stick I'm using? Because I don't want to know, right, once I've committed that code into the main branch, that another round of security testing is being done, and it's saying, well, you forgot about this, or this is bad, Michael, right? So the policy or the measuring stick you're using needs to be consistent. That's why you need a consistent approach to what you're measuring, but the testing facilities should be very different. So for example, so going back to me being an individual in testing, I want fast feedback, right? So if the scan's going to take half an hour, let's say, well, so, maybe I can tolerate that, maybe I can't, right? But within your CI, maybe a half an hour security test is more tolerable because there are a lot more other activities and your pipeline may last a bit longer. So therefore, relatively speaking, 30 minutes is not so long. But the point I'm trying to make is what's important is how you're measuring your security posture at the different stages should be consistent. So what I would call policy-driven approach.